And what I'm going to do is do a little question and answer with her. So please welcome everyone. We'd probably have the round of applause welcoming Catherine Gildiner. And thanks for coming and joining us, Catherine.
Oh, thanks. It's good to be here.
Yes. So what I'll do, Catherine, you've written some, I know you have many big fans here tonight. You've written some books, Too Close to the Falls, After the Falls, and Coming Ashore, which talked a bit about your childhood and your upbringing. So maybe you can give us some background before we head into your most current book that we're going to discuss tonight. So maybe you can give us some background on your childhood and those books.
Sure. When I was 4 years old, I was told, this is sort of from the first book. When I was 4 years old, I climbed to the top of a tree and I didn't come down. So they had to call the fire department. And I loved it. So I thought it was great. And I did it the next day. So my mother took me to the doctor and said, there's something wrong with her. And I think this is before they had labels like hyperactivity that didn't exist, right? That all I was called was busy, bossy, and Irish, right? So that's what they said I had. So my mother took me to the doctor, and this doctor said, well, she's got to work full time. She's got to be busy. So she went home and told my father, and my father said, who is going to hire a 4-year-old like to work full time? Like that's ridiculous. I'm going to have to do it. He owned a drugstore in Niagara Falls. So thus began my life of working full time at the age of 4. And the delivery car driver, I went with him all day long and night as well to deliver narcotics and other medicine to the Niagara frontier. And he was a black guy, so I got to see sort of the black side of the bars and the luncheon places and all of the the exciting black dance places, etc. I got to go to all of that. So I write about what it was like to have, my life as this little girl, but traveling around with Roy, and what, all the things I saw when I was delivering medication, and, how strange it was. So it was an unusual childhood. And I think it actually made me it made me really want to know more about people, because I think that's probably why I became a psychologist. Because I think most 4 or 5. I worked till Roy left when I was 12 there. So I went to the different ages. But I think that what happened was I saw people that I wouldn't see normally. So when you deliver medication, you have to remember medication is egalitarian. Everybody gets sick. Everybody needs antibiotics, whether you're rich or whether you're poor. So I would go into the to the DuPont nylon mansion and deliver medication there and get cookies and milk. And we would also deliver to the local prostitutes who needed antibiotics, right? So I thought, like, I didn't actually understand all of these different walks of life, but I saw that people were drastically different. And I wanted to really understand how and why they were different. So I think that kind of led to, to me becoming a psychologist. And then the next one was After the Falls, and I became involved with civil rights in the 60s, and then was investigated by the FBI for my relationship, if you can believe this, with the Black Panthers, which was completely crazy. I know, really wild.
Yeah.
So that is all. It's all about everything that happened in the 60s. And then the next book, Coming Ashore, is about my going to Oxford in England. Each book is in a way a fish out of water, sort of what it was like to be an American who was not upper crust in England, and how strange the English could be. And then coming to graduate school in Toronto, at University of Toronto, and my life as a Canadian. So it's all about trying to fit in what were strange circumstances.
Yeah. Yeah, they are. I loved your sense of humor in those books. They keep it light. And working in a library, I find that there's a lot of people that come in and they'll just ask, is there something that's maybe a little lighter and funny? And you know what? There isn't many, but yours are available, and
great. That's so nice to hear. That's so nice.
Yeah, and they continue to circulate a lot. So that's great. So last week, my book club, which is for the Collingwood Public Library. We read your book and then met as a group and discussed it. And what is not a surprise, but on the other hand is, everyone gave it a 5 except for 2 because they didn't know how to rate it because of how it was sort of psychological content. But 5 out of 5, that has never happened. I've been doing this book club for many years. So
that's so nice to hear.
Yeah. So we loved it. I read the book last summer and I put it on the list. I said, our group has to read this. It'll lead to some great discussions. So now we can talk about that book. So the title of the book is Good Morning Monster. I know many of you have read it and some of you haven't. So if you haven't, you must come and pick it up. We've got it at the library and it's also available. So I'm just going to shoot out some questions for you. So what brought about the transition from a therapist to an author and when you switched?
Right. Well, I was a psychologist for 25 years and I had been hearing, I think I was really full of hearing everybody's story. I heard every single story, but I was never able to give mine, right? Because that's not what a therapist does. So when I was 50, I made a decision that I was going to become a writer. And of course, everyone said, you're 50, you can't become a writer at 50. That's ridiculous. You're almost ready to retire, right? So, but that's what I did. And I said, I'm going to keep my office. And if my book does well, and then my book, Too Close to the Falls, was on the New York Times bestseller list, the Globe's bestseller list, and a bunch of other bestseller lists. So I said, oh my God, I can be a writer. Okay. So I decided to retire from psychology. And then I thought I maybe have 20 years left to write. So I've written 5. This is my 6th book.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. So you touched a bit on working with your father's pharmacy. Do you think that was a bit of a segue to the therapist as well?
Yes, I think so. I think it was dealing with the public.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that when most people deal with the public when they're teenagers, or not even then, actually, I'm always surprised that people don't deal with the public until they're older. And I started dealing with the public when I was younger, and I had to completely figure out ways in which, now, why is this person acting like this? And some people would be psychotic, and we delivered to the we did all the delivering to the mental hospital. It really was fascinating to me and frightening for me to be alone in the mental hospital at the age of 6, delivering stuff. But it was a childhood where I said to myself, I have to understand what's going on in people's lives and why are they so different. Like, we're all little babies at one point, and then we all grow up to be completely different. Like, what is happening, right? Yeah.
So in your book, Good Morning Monster, it was a gripping and compelling book for me, nonfiction, that I personally devoured. Your first patient, Laura, what did you learn from Laura?
Oh,
so you want to talk about her a bit?
Yeah, well, my first patient, I think everyone goes through this, no matter what your profession is. You go to university, or you get organized for whatever profession you're going to enter, and you think that you know everything. At least I thought I did. I thought, now that I've got this Ph.D. and I know statistics and I know this and I know that, and I've watched a million sessions on, through the one-way mirror, I'm totally ready to be a psychologist now. And then Laura was my first patient. And I was completely shocked, because I realized there's no PhD program that ever prepares you to be a therapist. It's half learning, but the other half is an art, and you've got to acquire it. And so I remember sitting there, because the reason I used Laura was because she was my first patient. And I said, I think I use the example in the book where I say, okay, I'm going to do a history now. I want to do a history of your past. And everybody, you have to understand, everybody gives a history. Even people that are psychotic give a history. I mean, I've had people at Clark Institute who have said they are the Virgin Mary and they were born and raised in Nazareth, right? I mean, I have had all of it, right? Yeah. But so she said, I'm not giving a history. I'm paying money to be here. My doctor says I have stress. I have to get rid of, I'm not going to spend my time talking about the village idiots. No way. I just want to know, I want to know from you how to get rid of stress. Yeah. This was, 1980, I think. Yeah. So I thought right away, oh my God, part of my job is to engage her. part of my job is to say, okay, we really have to look at your background. We have to look at, there's a lot of things that we have to look at. So I suddenly realized, oh, this is a very, very different job than I thought it was. Because I mean, I thought, well, everyone's coming to me for help in my office, so it's going to be really easy because they want the help. People want help, but they have elaborate defenses, that avoid that push them away from seeing what they need to see. And that's what defenses are for, so that we are not psychotic, so that we can all push back some stuff and function in this world. And it's my job, like an onion, to peel that away, layer by layer by layer. And that's what I had to do with Laura.
Yeah. Actually, on a personal note, my daughter is just finishing up high school and she's going to be studying psychology.
Oh,
When I was reading the book last summer, and her friend was at the cottage as well, and I said to them, "Oh, you have to read this book." And in our and she's just finishing up high school. She'll get to her.
I love that age group. I give talks to high schools. Yeah.
Yeah. So in our book club, we talked about it, and people thought maybe the content was a bit much for that. And I thought, I just wondered what your opinion was. Would that be a good introduction for her to what she could be in for? Like, I felt like it would be a good learning experience for her to learn it, as well as interesting and what most readers would get out of it. But from the educational side, would you recommend that age group read it?
I would, because look at what's on television. Look what people see on television.
Exactly.
It's 1,000 times worse than this, and you see it graphically.
Yeah.
Right? There's actually no sex and no violence. It's just description of what happened.
Yeah.
And I also think I sometimes give talks to high schools, and they say, one of the girls very often say, after I read your book, and I would see people, because I'm downtown Toronto, so we see people sleeping on, heating grates and, on University Avenue. They said, I suddenly looked at them differently. Like, I thought, oh my God, what happened to you? So, it's amazing you can walk and talk after what probably happened in your life, instead of judging them in some way, like get a job, right? Saying, really understanding what can happen to people, and that it's actually brave to even keep your sanity.
Yes.
So, and I think teenagers need to know that,
not
every childhood is like their own. And as one kid said to me, I thought my parents were horrible. And of course they're not. She said, I realized they're really not bad. When you start looking at this book and, what parents could really be like, I realized that, I was complaining about nothing. So I think that they need some perspective.
Yes. Working at a library, we see a lot, and we have a lot of training in that. And actually, we had an art show of a high school student, and she took photographs of people struggling in the streets of Toronto, and it went international, and it brought the awareness to the high school students here in Collingwood, as well as internationally, made it the national news. So that was exciting.
Yeah, that's great.
We'll move on to our next hero in your book, Peter. He was presenting a problem with impotence, and at the therapy, it cured his problem. Can you discuss that and how the YouTube Harrow monkey studies helped in that situation?
Right. Well, Peter was a Chinese male, still is a Chinese male. And he was referred to me by a urologist. And a urologist called me and said, they're doing a lot of work at Toronto General Hospital. Now, this goes back, when I give talks to teenagers, they can't believe this story, that this is before Viagra. Before Viagra was invented. People go, oh my God, right? Like, are you that old, right? But it was before Viagra, and it dealt with impotence. And there was a drug from Germany where they would inject it into males' penises, and then it would work for 3 days, which is way too long. So they were trying to titrate, depending on who you are.
Yes.
They were trying to titrate it and find out exactly how much you have to give for whatever. And it's a drug from Germany, and they were trying to get it okayed in Canada, and it worked for everybody amazingly well. In fact, too well. But it didn't work with Peter at all. He had no effect. So he called me and he said, "This guy is wrecking my study. Like, we want to get this. This is the typical surgeon, right? I don't mean typical, but he said, look, I want to get this drug okayed, and now my results aren't going to look as good as I needed them to be." And so I never ever refer anybody to a psychologist, but I thought maybe there's something going on that I don't know, because the drug is going into his system and his vessels are okay. We've checked him, we've put him in the hospital, we've left him there for days, we've checked everything about him, and there's no reason why this can't work. So I'm sending him to you. So I said, okay. So when he arrived, he was about 30, average looking Chinese male. And he said, he was there for impotence, but I often find that to just begin to discuss what somebody's referred for is not a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
I always say, let's go back. Let's talk about your childhood. Let's get all of those things basically, I want to understand you before I understand your presenting problem, right? Because I said, I like to start, it's like, therapy is like an archaeological dig. You have to dig down and dig and then say, oh, I found something, I'll put that here. Oh, I found this, I'll put that here. So, and then the surface, the tip of the iceberg then becomes more clear. So, so when I started talking to him, I realized that he'd failed kindergarten. Oh. And I said, oh, why did you fail kindergarten? Do you have any idea what happened? And he said, I said, was it a language problem, et cetera? And he said, no, what happened was my mother locked me away in an attic for basically all my life until I went to kindergarten. And so when I got out to go to kindergarten, I failed, I guess, as my mother said, because I'm stupid. So I said, so we went over kindergarten, and he had not heard English. He had not heard Chinese. He couldn't speak either language, right? Yeah. Also, think of what you learn in 5 years, the first 5 years. Like when you were supposed to stand in a circle, hold hands. The idea of being near someone and touching someone else was terrifying for him because he'd never touched anybody. Yeah. So when they would say, to stand around and do this, that, and the other thing, so they had all kinds of games, and sometimes people boys play rough and tumble games. Absolutely terrified. He thought people were trying to kill him. He had no idea what it was like to do any of those things. So the teacher rather wisely said, you're not ready for kindergarten. I mean, I think now I hope that schools are different and that they would say, you need psychological help and we're going to call the family. We're going to do all this, et cetera. But they didn't. But anyway, when he was locked in this room, his parents gave they worked in a restaurant in a small Canadian town. And they managed to work about 16 to 18 hours a day. They worked all the time in the restaurant, and they grew vegetables, Chinese vegetables, to send into Toronto, right? So they would be out at night with lights still working. Mm-hmm. So that they thought, okay, best to put him in this attic and we'll just leave him there. So they actually wound up owning 3 huge apartment buildings, and neither of them could speak English at all, ever. So, I mean, they were incredibly, incredibly hardworking. One day somebody came into the restaurant and left a little tiny piano. And the piano was like, those kind of pianos that Linus has, the little white piano, right? Yeah. So it was like one of those little tiny things. And somebody left it in the restaurant. So the mother just dumped it in the room with him. It's the only thing he had. A tomato can he had for excretion, a crib, and this. And his mother was very angry at him because if he missed this tomato can, she beat him. But the tomato can was an industrial one and it was higher than he was, right? So he ran into just all day problems. So he got this piano and he played it. He didn't know that it was an instrument. So he would play it and then he would hold it up to his heart and it would vibrate. It would make vibrating sounds. And it was like he was hugging it and it was hugging him back. Yeah. So he had his first attachment was to this piano. And then when he started to play it, he would play, if he was sad, he'd play it really sad. And if he was happy, he'd make it really plinky and, happy. So he thought that the piano was talking to him. And so they developed a communication with the tiny piano. He grew up to become a very well-known musician. And Downbeat magazine said about him that he was someone who could laugh and cry and make his instrument speak for him, which is interesting, right? Yeah. So then, because that's exactly what he did. His instrument was his mother. Yeah. So when I told him, you didn't fail kindergarten because you were stupid. That isn't, it has nothing to do with it, but it was very hard to get him to understand that, right? So I'd say, you don't know what you were missing for and what was wrong with you. So I actually took him. This is before the internet, if you can imagine. There's another thing that's really old. And I took him to University of Toronto. My office is there, so I took him to a special place. And I ran the Harlow monkey studies. I don't know if anybody who's taken Psych 101 has seen these studies. It's where Harlow, he separates the baby monkeys from the mothers. And then he gives them a wire mother and a cloth mother, right? And so when the monkey gets frightened, it goes to the cloth mother, and it doesn't go to the wire mother much at all, just a little tiny bit so that it can eat. And it becomes attached to the wire mother. But then Harlow said, let's start introducing things into the cage that are new, that are like something that a monkey might like a swing, So they would put a little swing in, and the monkey would be terrified, just terrified. Because they thought maybe this is something to kill me. Maybe he missed the exploratory stage with his mother with him. Babies explore the world by running back to their mother and going like this, and then taking another little step, right? He missed all of the idea of exploration. He had no attachment, so everything became very frightening for him. And when he was watching this, he just started sweating and saying, "Oh my God, this is me in kindergarten. This is absolutely me." And then when they introduced, like for the ones that were older, they introduced a female monkey to the male, the male to the female, to mate them.
Yeah.
The female would go absolutely crazy. Heartbeat would be out of control. All of fur would stand on end. And she thought he was trying to kill her. She thought, why is he getting on top? Why is this happening? Like, I don't. So everyone has a fantasy that, everybody learns how to have sex. It just happens, right? I don't know. It happens. Well, it actually doesn't. Right? Yeah. What really happens is you hold on to your mom, and then in your mom is everything. And then you have little friends, and then you play with friends, and then you have group dating, and then you have, more formal dating, and you talk to your friends about boys, and boys talk about girls. There's a huge amount that goes in between birth and sexual development. Right? Yeah. And if you miss the birth part, if you miss that, you can't go to the next step.
Right.
So he said right away, "Oh my God, that's what happens to me during sex. That's exactly what happens." Yeah. So, so it was, I gave grand rounds with this doctor at Toronto General. And it was really interesting because I said, what really happened is Peter left his body. He just, he couldn't live there anymore. When his mother was beating him, he was in this room. So he began to become psychotic, like the babies in Bulgaria and, the ones that are left alone in those cribs. You see, he began to see Peter on the other side of the room. He would be standing over there and say, "Poor Peter, he's getting beaten. Isn't that awful? Sad for Peter." So what he did when he became anxious is he learned how to leave his body. So when he got all of these medications for impotence, he left his body. He did, every drug, as I tried to point out to all these surgeons, every drug goes to your mind first. It goes up to your mind, and then your mind says where it should go, right? I mean, everything goes to the brain first. So it just went to the brain, and then it said, "Oh, not for Peter." So nothing ever happened. They were really amazed by that was such a powerful effect.
Yeah. Huh. Now we'll move to Handsome Danny.
Handsome Danny.
Yeah. Handsome Danny.
Yeah.
He actually helped you in some ways, consulting with the Indigenous psychiatrist, Dr. Brandt.
Yes, he was I couldn't have done the case without Dr. Brandt.
So how did his relationship skills develop from his wife to his girlfriend?
Right. Well, I mean, everything with Danny really had to do with being abducted at the age of 5. He's one of the last trapper families around, up way up north, where you have to take planes to fly in. His mother and father were trappers, and one day two, as he said, white men in leather shoes, because nobody wears leather shoes in the wild. Yeah. He thought that was just the weirdest thing. Came and took him and said, you are going to to his parents, it's illegal for you to have your children anymore. They're going to become white people now. We need to do this. It's for the Canadian government, and you won't see them for a long time. Goodbye. They took them and sent them thousands of miles away. So he was then sent to a residential school. Right. Now, this goes back to 1982. I mean, just to talk about psychologists being out of it and how much you have to know about different cultures. This is before the cultural thing, had taken, no one had heard of residential schools. So I said, oh, residential school, was that, oh, how nice, a boarding school. So you went to a boarding school, isn't that great? So this is how much I had to learn, right? So it took, the reason it took 5 years is I said I had to get up to speed, right? So he was sexually abused. Everything had happened to him there. And, physically abused. He lost 40% of his body weight. And a third of the people there died just from malnutrition or just whatever. So, and then what happened was he saw his sister one day and he said, Tanisi, which is hello in Cree. So he kept waving to her because he saw her in another area, and he was so thrilled that she was there that the priest said, you can never use Cree language. You cannot use an Indian. It was all called Indian then. You can't use an Indian language. And so he said, hello, hello. He just kept saying it. And then the priest hit him, and then finally hit him so much that he was in the infirmary for, about 2 weeks. And when I talked to a GP, the GP told me that his back was incredible and that he needed stitches and that he never got them. And he said, it was whatever happened to him was just incredible. So we talk about triggers. Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, a trigger for Danny was the Cree language.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
If someone spoke Cree, he would go like, whoa, I got to get out of here, And he said there were tons of them like that. And he said, what was wonderful, what the residential school did perfectly was supposed to make you into an English person. They had to confess in confession every week that they were a savage, and then they had to be forgiven. But he said what they did really well was take away all your Indian identity. He said, but they didn't give us any other identity. They just stripped the Indian part off, but we didn't become white. So we didn't have anything. We didn't have anything to cling on to. Right. Mm-hmm. So he married someone, a white woman, and he had no idea how to have intimacy or how to. He was fine with physical intimacy, but he had no idea how to emotionally connect. But how he got himself through this horrible residential school thing, he did better than almost anybody other Native I've ever seen, in the sense that he owned a big apartment. He had a great job. He read a lot. He didn't drink ever. Didn't do drugs. I mean, so what he said was, I'm never going to do any of those things, and I'm never going to feel. I'm not going to start feeling, because if I feel like when I saw my sister, I got the hell beaten out of me. It's important. I'll just freeze myself here until I leave. And then what happened is he was permanently frozen.
Yeah.
So, as his wife said, I don't know you any better than I knew you the first week we married. So he wasn't able to connect.
Yeah.
And so, then she was killed on the 401 with her child. That's how he was sent to me by his boss. And because he said he had no reaction, he just stayed working. Right. So we worked a lot on, like I said, if you are frozen and you can't feel anything negative, like you can't be frightened because you're frozen. That's a good defense. But if you're frozen, you can't feel anything positive. I said, you can't feel hope. I remember he started laughing and he said, I can live without hope. Like he just thought hope was like, are you kidding? Hope you're talking about here? So that's what happened with him. Then what was your about the relationship. So then he finally learned, he got involved with a Native woman, and we had to go inch by inch about relationships. Right? Like she once sat on his lap at breakfast, is a warm thing to do. And that's what the priest had him do, sit on his lap. Right. And that was a trigger for him. So he just wanted to say, oh my God, and run out. So then he started thinking about the therapy, and he really knew that he had to see that he had rights. He had no idea before he had any rights. or that anything inside should come outside. He didn't get that. So, he would said, this, I like you, but this is making me feel very uncomfortable. It doesn't have anything to do with you. And he started explaining all that. So he was then able to have more of a real relationship but we had to start at square one, to get that going.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's great that he got to that level with the next girlfriend, even after the loss of
Yeah.
Yeah. So Alana is the next hero. With her father, who was an addict on LSD, and she was thrown overboard off the boat with her sister, and they almost drowned. And their dad's friend Art, who appeared to be a hero because he came to save them, but was not a great guy. Why was this a transitional moment for Alana?
It was, first of all, her father was not just disturbed; he was also a sadist. Like sometimes people are bad, and you try to find some way to say what's their diagnosis, right? He was also just very cruel, to top it off. And I think his mother had been cruel to him or whatever. And he was very smart. He was one of the top people at a computer company, but they fired him for sadism, actually, because he electrocuted the cat in the warehouse. Yeah. And thought it was hilarious. And, all of that. Like, the thing about sadists is they have to be surrounded with other sadists for them to find things amusing. Like, they don't really get, oh, that's not really funny, killing the cat. I thought it was a scream, but she, and so he got rid of the mother. He framed her for heroin use, etc. So then he had her, just all to himself. And then he used to rape her on a nightly basis. I won't go into the details, but he always said to her, "You're horrible. You're like your mother. You're frigid." I mean, she's 6 years old, right? 7, 8, 9. So he would just called her all of these names and said, "You're awful." So she believed it. She said, "Oh, I guess normal people do this with their father. I don't know what it's called, but I don't like it." And she would always try to make up excuses or say she didn't like it. And then he would always say, "You're frigid, you're bad." So then one time when he was when he had LSD out on the raft, and he threw them both in the water, his friend Art had to dive in and try to save them. And then he said, "You are such an idiot. You're such an asshole. What is wrong with you? Are you crazy? You are a completely awful person." He said, "We could go to jail for this, like jail. I've been in jail," Art said. "I don't want to go back." So it was really, and he said, "Plus, we have fun with these little girls. What's going to happen if they die?" Right? Just awful. But that moment when he said, "You're crazy. You're an absolutely crazy lunatic." She was about 8 at the time, I think, or 6 or 8. And it registered with her, "Oh my God, I'm not the problem. He's the problem." Like, she had no idea, because they live way, way out in the middle of nowhere in the mountains out west. So
that's all she knew.
That's all she knew. So suddenly she realized, oh, okay, I just have to get to an age where I can get out of here. And he's a crazy person. And it's my job to protect my sister, who's 2 years younger. And that was a good thing that kept her sanity, having that sister, because she realized he would do to the sister what he'd done to her if she was gone. That's why she couldn't, run away. The other thing is, if she ran away and the child services said, "No, he's fine. There's nothing wrong with him. You go back there," right? Then she'd be, in huge trouble, right? So I think her finally, somebody labeling him was the best thing that ever happened to her. Even though it was Art and he was horrible too.
Yes. Yeah. Pivotal.
Yeah.
So now we'll move to the final hero of the book, and that's Madeleine. She coined her mother the monster, or she was coined by the monster.
Yeah, she was coined by her mother as the monster.
Yes.
Yeah.
And was successful in her school and her career, and she became a perfectionist and a workaholic. Why is this behavior so hard for her to change?
Well, and I think she still works on it to this day. If she gets anxious, she gets back into her workaholic behaviors. Well, she had a mother who, of course, everybody thinks that if you're rich, you don't have problems. like it can't be so terrible. But her father was very, very rich. And he went to visit somebody in Martha's Vineyard, and her mother's mother sent her there and said, don't come home unless you're engaged to him. Because she was the era of the gold digger. You were only as good as your husband was, right? So, that's one of the things. I mean, when people marry that are very rich, you always have to say, are they marrying me for my money? But in fact, she did. That's what she married him for, right? It was her money, and then was his money. And then when they got back to Toronto, he said, well, now we have to have a family. And she said, no, why would I want a family? I don't want a family. I want to just, redecorate the house and travel. I'm not having anything. So then he said, yeah, but I mean, what do we do with all of our money? And she said, I'll spend it. Don't worry, right? So he said, no, they had to have one child. She didn't want to. So they had the one child, Madeleine. And then she was, her mother was always cruel to her and made her, basically pimped her out to rich people is what happened with her. So she was very, very pretty, the mother. So, she knew how to be, to assume a personality. She could go to the country club. She could go places and be very, not really adequate because she was always having affairs and, doing stuff like that. But she told every day, she told Madeleine she was a monster. Like every day, Madeleine would come down the stairs and she'd say, oh, good morning, monster. What do you want to, what are you going to have today? So, and also the mother was an anorexic and used to get enraged at Madeleine for eating if she ate anything. Like she'd think in the morning, she'd, want a piece of toast, right? No, she said, you pig, do you want to be fat? So, it was hell. So and then when Madeleine she's a very bright little girl, and she had all kinds of things going for her. And so when she would, work hard and do this and that, and she was head of at school and on this team and on that team, and she won the valedictorian award. So then she'd say, but I don't understand. Nobody else says I'm a monster. Mm-hmm. And she said, I am your mother. Only mothers know. Nobody else knows. I mean, but unless they live with you, they're not going to know what a monster you are. So you better be careful who you hook up with, because they're going to find out what a monster you are. Now, I mean, you can say, well, why would the mother do that? I think it's because the mother was really frightened of Madeleine, because she had no idea how to parent. Yeah. She had no idea how to parent. And whenever anybody else would say, oh, she went with her father, the two of them went to a game or something. She goes, oh, for heaven's sakes, getting a parent to dragging you there. She said, she is a baby. Why do they baby her all the time? She's always babied. So she saw parenting as babying. Yeah. And then, but Madeleine thought, well, that looks pretty good. Like, it looks like, she's getting a lot of care. And she'd say, oh my God, she said, she's going to grow up to be nothing. Look at you. I've made you valedictorian. You know how to work. Yeah. So what happens is when she in her romantic attraction, when she became attracted to someone, she became terrified that they would find out she was a monster. Oh, yeah. So she, because if you lived with somebody, they're going to know you're a monster, right? Because that's what her mother always said, right? So and the mother was a real psychopath, but she was very good at it, And then, when she finally became interested in someone, she went right off the rails. And that's when I got called in and had to say to her, we had to start from the very, very beginning until she finally saw that her mother was a psychopath and was terrified of being a parent, had no idea how to do it, and wasn't interested. Mm-hmm. And she really didn't like Madeleine, because Madeleine made her look bad. Because sometimes the school would call and say, you were supposed to pick her up at rowing after school and you weren't there. We had waited for 2 hours and you weren't there. Then she'd say, you went whining to that school, you little monster. So it was, So, it was a no-win. Yeah. Right. And the father was as afraid of her as Madeleine. She ran into the basement once to hide from the mother, and she found him there eating SpaghettiOs out of a can. Both of them were frightened of her. Yeah. Yeah.
Huh. So there's a common theme there about what we've grown to learn is the first, childhood years are so important, and the attachment to the mothers, and in most of those cases that shows up. So what time are we at here? I think we'll open up the chat feature and see if people have some questions. You can put it in the chat box about the book or just general questions. Let's see. Okay, there's one there. Let me scroll. Okay, I've learned about your book. Sorry about the font size is small for me as I struggle. I've learned about your book from CBC radio interview. Your book had profound effect on helping me understand my relationship and my childhood. It's a privilege for me to hear this line of interview tonight. I'm very grateful. Thank you, Carmen. And she's from Midhurst. Yes, because we have people from all different areas.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other comments or questions? Let's see. And you can also raise your hand or got a big group here tonight. Don't be shy.
I see where it says chat, there's 3.
Oh, okay.
There's 4.
Okay, now they're coming. Thank you for sharing your experiences. How do you keep your sanity?
That is so interesting, because that is one of the things that I never, ever predicted anybody would say. And since I've written the book, if I give a talk to 20 people, at least 2 will say, how did you keep your sanity? Like, I'm completely blown away by it, right? Because it isn't something that I ever questioned. I think that the way I approach it is the way when someone said, how could you stand to hear about like what happened to Laura, right? Or not Laura, Alana. Some of those details were really awful. And in fact, when I wrote the book, the editor said, get those details out, get them out. Nobody can read that. It's horrible. So I redid the Alana chapter 3 times to make it easier than it was to read. And even now people go, oh my God, that was too much for me. So, I mean, I think what happens is it's the same thing with surgeons, right? I keep going back to, my husband's a doctor, so I keep going back to, like, if you've got surgeons, they go, well, we cut this leg off today. And then, I said, I got to get this done by 5 o'clock, right? So, I mean, so that you become more callous to your surroundings, because if you don't become callous, you can't do it. Mm-hmm. You absolutely can't do it. And I think some people are very high on empathy and low on skills where you're trying to put things together, insight or whatever. I mean, we all have different qualities, right? And I wouldn't say that empathy is my biggest quality. I'd say I'm more of a problem solver. So when, she would tell me something that happened, or Peter would tell me something that happened, I would say, okay, now how am I going to tie this into the case? How am I going to get him to see the point that I want him to see, right? From what he's told me. So I was always in a way working and not really absorbing the pain that he was feeling as much as I was absorbing how to get him better. So I think I looked at all the problems as intellectual problems, and I didn't get emotionally involved with those. So when I was telling somebody about this, somebody who works with trauma in the US, they run a trauma center. And he was saying, that's so weird that you're saying that. He said, because everybody that works with severe trauma, they all say they're low on empathy. And you'd think it would be the other way around. He said, but empathy really scares people that are traumatized. I said, oh, that is so true. Because when I would see Laura, for example, and Laura told me about her father, and I'd say, wow, that must have been really hard for you. That must have been painful. And she said, don't Mr. Rogers me. I don't want it. Like she just saw that empathy as a bad TV show. And also because they've hardened themselves to get through life, when you give them empathy, they become very frightened because it's going to open doors that they don't want to open. So so a lot of people that work with people with trauma aren't as empathetic as other therapists might be. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that when I was a little, I was talking to this trauma guy, and he said, oh, you really need to look up all the literature on women raised by fathers. So, and I was raised by my father mostly, because I hardly ever went home. So, I think the studies show that women raised by men are quite different. They're lower in empathy and higher in problem solving, right? Mm-hmm. So when, for example, when I was like a little girl of about 6, I would deliver cancer medication to people alone, people that are alone that have cancer and they can't get out of bed and they can't get their medication and they don't know how, they can't get water, shake their pill. So, you'd have to go and do that. So then I called my father and said, I really think this guy is dying. Like, what are we going to do? He said, we've got diabetes, like we've got insulin to deliver to 22 people. It's not your problem. You got to get it back in the truck and you have to take care of everything else because people won't have their insulin. Yeah. So I mean, that's and when I would go home and tell my mother, she'd go, oh, that's terrible. What did you do? Oh my God, how did you leave him? Oh, that sounds horrible. So there were those two reactions. And I finally, I think if you spend enough time with a male reaction, you start absorbing it.
Yeah.
Yeah. You start absorbing that reaction. So when I read those studies, I thought, wow, that's really, really interesting. Because I don't think a lot of people would say to a man, how did you stand it? Nobody says to a surgeon, how do you cut off limbs all day long, right? Yeah. I mean, nobody does that, right? Because they just figure, well, that's their job.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very true. Let's see. Oh, someone asked if you're still practicing counseling at all.
No, I ran out of what little empathy I had. No, I stopped when I was 50 because I wanted to become a writer. So I did, yeah. And in fact, I was pretty burned out because I had worked really hard, long hours, and I put so much of myself into it that I think I just burned out. And I didn't. Everyone said, "Oh, you should write a book about therapy." I thought, no way, right? And then it took 20 years, and then suddenly I wanted to write a book about therapy and everything that happened. And I'm really eager to talk about it now. But it took 20 full years for me to replenish my, whatever it is.
I can imagine. And then a comment was, I can see where you develop ideas about yourself from your parents, because her dad used to say to her as a child, you don't have brains, God gave geese. So I think that was common sometimes to say things like that, and then it has such effects. But
right, profound effects, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, usually that only happens if it gets repeated in different ways.
Okay.
Once a one-off isn't really going to do that. But if somebody's giving you that message, usually people, if a parent is giving you that message, they're giving it to you sort of 6 ways to Sunday.
Oh, yeah. And Marge says, I know Tony, and I'm not going to be able to say his last, Bellamiso. Do you remember? I don't. Bellisimo.
Nope.
No? Oh, okay.
Ring a bell.
Okay. I'm a retired social worker, and I'm really enjoying your sharing tonight. I'm looking forward to reading your books. Oh, okay, good.
Great.
Did you consult your patients before including them in the book?
Oh, yes, that was, yeah, you have to do that. And then if some people, of course, don't want to be in the book, so you have to say, okay, so, I mean, you've got to, I think Peter led the group by saying, Peter said, I don't really want to be in the book. He said, because he's a very private person, and all the things that happened to him were very private, the impotence, all of that stuff. But then he said, if it helps one person, even one person, then it will be worth it. And there's not a lot, especially in 1980, about Chinese family therapy. Very little. And he said, like people think that Chinese people have these perfect children and do everything perfectly and that the parents are perfect and that there's never any problems. And he said, and it's not true. And I want to open that so that, people are able to look at that. But he said, so, I mean, I did a lot to change his case because he's a pretty famous musician. So I had to do a lot to change his case around, but I still kept that he was Chinese and that he was a musician. But I had to do a lot of changing of the things. And then when I had my book launch, he came with his sister, his mother and father are dead, but he came with his sister, and his sister told me that it was a nightmare for her to read the book, because his sister, the parents said, you have to sit in this booth in the restaurant and never move and never talk.
Oh.
So she sat there like that for 8 hours a day, but then she didn't have to go away anywhere. And he, because of what had happened to him. And she said, whenever we would take him to the pediatrician would say, why is his head flat in the back? Because he was doing too much laying on his head. She said, and then I would have to translate. And I wanted desperately to tell the doctor. I wanted to say, you don't know what's going on. I'm 8 years old. She said, but my mother was so terrifying that I never could. She said, but when I read the book, I was like, oh, I always thought that I'd been negligent. And she said, now I even feel more negligent. And I said, well, you wouldn't have been able to alter it. But, when you look at what's happening to Peter, you don't think of the rest of the family.
No.
And what they're going through, she went through hell.
Yeah. Would you like to say more about skipping a stage in childhood? For example, an 8-year-old character who would take care of a younger sibling, and you brought her into the schoolyard to help her realize an 8-year-old school children should be carefree. So I guess talking about an 8-year-old and skipping stages, I guess.
I don't fully understand the question.
The third character in the book. Okay, that's what they're referring to.
Oh, who would be?
That is Alana? No, wait.
Yeah, Alana.
Yeah, because, or maybe it was Danny.
Oh, I know what she's talking about. She's talking about Laura. And I remember when Laura, it's actually the first case in the book, she says when her father abandoned her, left her in a cabin up north alone, and she had a 6-year-old brother and a 7-year-old sister to look after. And she managed to do it from November to April, right? And get everybody to school every day, which is pretty shocking, right?
Shocking.
Yeah, and I mean, she was only caught when finally she was waiting for the bus. All 3 of them were waiting for the bus one Saturday morning because they didn't know it was Saturday.
Oh.
So the police drove them home and then found out everything. But, yeah, I mean, she did fairly well. And she's such an incredible survivor that she ran out of things. She didn't, how does an 8-year-old know how to parent? I mean, she knew how to get food on the table. She stole clothes. She got food. She's very resourceful, but she didn't know what went into being a parent because she's 8 years old. So the brother started bedwetting and the sister started crying. And she just thought, I've got to have something here before they send us to foster care. So she began watching television and she saw Colonel Potter from MASH. When I give talks to high school, they've never heard of anybody named Colonel Potter, right?
Yep.
So Colonel Potter, he would talk to Radar, the character in the book, and say, don't worry, Radar, everything will be fine. We'll all be home by next Christmas. Don't worry, everything's going to be okay. So she said, oh, maybe that's what a parent does. So she started imitating Colonel Potter and things worked much better. But then when she, even in our 3rd year of therapy, she would say to me, I really, really failed my brother and sister. They, when I was taking care of them, I said, you were 8.
Yeah.
Right. So then she said, well, 8's really old. She said, my dad knew I could take care of everybody. So, I mean, the father gave her the idea that 8-year-olds do this all the time. What's the problem? Right. So I took her to a classroom of 8-year-olds. I drove in my car. I have a friend who's a principal, and I said, no, I want you to sit here. And so, they're little. They were little tiny bites, and, 8's very little. And so she saw them. And then I thought she'd get in the car and she would say, oh my God, I expected so much for myself. Right. But she didn't. She got in the car and she looked at me and she said, they were immature.
Oh,
right.
Yeah.
But I think that it did actually sink in. But sometimes things sink in a lot later. You have to think about, wow, that was what an 8-year-old was. I had no idea what that meant.
No.
Yeah.
Well, here we are at almost 8 o'clock. So if I think we've made it through most of our questions. So maybe we'll wrap things up, and I'll do some thank yous. Thank you for all the participating libraries. So we have folks from
Thank you.
Collingwood, Wasaga Beach, Ramera, Penetang, Innisfil, Springwater, and Barrie. And we'll be doing more author talks coming up. Next week we have one, so check your local website or reach out to your librarian to sign up for those. And I really appreciate you joining us tonight, Catherine. It was a thrill. Our group loved your book, and if you haven't read it, I know the people listening will, because it was a fabulous book. I really enjoyed it and learned a lot. And yeah, so thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.